The cowboy found the orphan in the snow. The rancher said, "Build a fire, we'll raise her together." The snow had fallen through the night without pause, smoothing the land into something deceptively quiet. And the cowboy almost missed the shape near the tree line because stillness was common out here and life was not. His horse slowed before he did, ears flicking, and when the cowboy looked again, he saw a small form half buried against a drift, dark hair stiff with frost and a coat too thin for mercy. He dismounted fast, boots breaking crusted ice as he knelt, and when he brushed snow from the girl's face, her skin was cold enough to steal his breath. Her lips pale, eyes closed, as if sleep had finally won. She could not have been more than 6 or 7, light as nothing when he lifted her, and the absence of tracks told him what he needed to know. She had been out here long enough for the storm to erase how she'd come. He wrapped her in his coat and turned the horse back toward the ranch without hesitation, because stopping meant death and questions could wait for warmth. The wind cut hard across the open ground, stinging his face as he rode, holding her close, counting each shallow breath she took against his chest to make sure they did not stop. By the time the ranch came into view, smoke rising thin from the chimney, his hands were numb and his jaw locked against panic he would not allow himself to feel yet. The rancher met him at the door, taking in the scene in a single glance, and did not ask where she came from or why she was alone, because answers would not change what needed to happen next. "Build a fire," he said, already moving, already clearing space, his voice steady in a way that pulled the room back from the edge. The cowboy laid the girl near the hearth, rubbing her hands, willing warmth into skin that barely remembered it, while the rancher worked the stove, coaxing flame like it mattered as much as breath. When the girl coughed weakly, a thin sound that cut through the crackle of fire, both men froze, then leaned in closer, relief arriving sharp and dangerous. The rancher set a kettle on and said they would warm her slow, that rushing could kill her just as surely as cold. And the cowboy nodded, trusting the calm because calm was earned out here. Outside, the snow kept falling, uncaring, sealing off the world beyond the walls. And in that isolation, a decision began to take shape without being spoken yet. The cowboy watched the girl's chest rise and fall, watched color return to her cheeks by degrees. And when he looked at the rancher again, the words came simple and final, spoken like a fact already decided. She would not be sent back into that cold. Not today. Not ever. And the rancher answered him without drama, adding wood to the fire and saying they would raise her together, because some choices were made once and carried for life. The fire caught slowly, the kind of flame that needed patience instead of force. And the rancher insisted on it, because rushing warmth into a frozen body could finish what the cold had started. The cowboy kept the girl close to the hearth, but not against it, his coat still wrapped around her, feeling how light she was in his arms, how little resistance her body offered when he adjusted his grip. Her breathing was shallow and uneven, each rise of her chest something he counted without meaning to, afraid that if he stopped watching, it would stop too. The rancher warmed water on the stove, testing it with care before touching it to her lips, saying nothing, letting action carry what words could not. When the girl coughed weakly, both men froze, then leaned closer, relief arriving sharp and restrained, because survival out here never announced itself loudly. Outside, the wind pushed against the walls, reminding them how close death still stood. And the cowboy kept his body between the child and the door, as if instinct alone could hold the storm back. Her eyes fluttered open briefly, unfocused and dark with fear, and she tried to move before strength returned, a reflex learned from running rather than resting. The rancher spoke then, low and steady, telling her she was inside, that the snow could not touch her anymore, and the certainty in his voice mattered more than reassurance. She settled slightly, fingers twitching against the blanket he placed over her shoulders, the smell of smoke and wool grounding her in something unfamiliar but solid. Questions hovered at the edge of the room: where she had come from, who she belonged to, how long she had been alone. But neither man gave them breath, because answers would not warm her and could wait for daylight. The ranchers said they would keep her awake just enough that sleep came later, and the cowboy nodded, eyes fixed on the fire, understanding that vigilance was now part of care. When the girl whispered, barely audible, asking if the snow was still there, the rancher answered honestly that it was, but that it no longer mattered, because it had lost its claim. The cowboy felt something settle into him then, not relief, but resolve, because warmth had not saved her yet. Only time and attention would, and both men understood that whatever happened next would be decided not by the storm outside, but by how long they were willing to keep the fire alive together. Daylight arrived without ceremony, a pale wash of gray pushing through the frost-rimmed window, and the girl stirred as if the light itself had touched her first, eyelids fluttering open to a room that smelled of smoke and boiled water instead of snow. She did not cry out, but her body tensed, shoulders drawing inward as she took in unfamiliar walls, unfamiliar men, and the quiet that followed her waking. And the cowboy eased back a step to give her space while staying close enough to be seen. The rancher moved slowly, setting a cup down where she could watch him do it, saying only that the fire was still burning and would stay that way, because certainty mattered more than explanation when fear was fresh. The girl's gaze tracked the hearth, the crackle steady and real, and her breathing deepened in small increments, each one loosening the night's grip. When she tried to sit up and faltered, the cowboy steadied her with a single hand, careful not to rush, and she nodded once in acknowledgement, a gesture that felt older than her years. Outside, the storm had thinned to a quiet fall. The land softened rather than erased, and the ranchers said they would wait until her hands were warm before she drank anything stronger, that bodies remembered patience when given the chance. She whispered then, asking where she was, and the rancher answered simply that she was safe for now, not promising more than he could keep. And the honesty settled the room. The cowboy fetched a bowl of warm broth and let the steam drift first, letting smell lead before taste, and the girl accepted a few careful sips, eyes never leaving the fire, as if it were a witness she trusted. Questions pressed forward, her name, how she'd come to be alone, whether anyone would look for her. But both men held them back, understanding that mourning did not ask permission, and neither should fear be interrogated before it eased. When the girl finally spoke her name, it came out thin but clear, and the rancher repeated it once, so she could hear it held by someone else, and something in her posture softened at the sound. The cowboy glanced at the rancher then, a look that carried the weight of work yet to be done, and the rancher answered it with a nod, already thinking ahead to blankets dried, boots mended, and the long business of choosing what came next. Outside, the snow kept falling, quieter now, and the girl watched it through the window without flinching, because the morning had not asked permission to arrive, and neither had the chance she'd been given. And all three understood that what followed would be decided not by how she had been found, but by how carefully they treated the day that had begun. The ranch stayed quiet as the morning settled, the kind of quiet that did not demand answers, but allowed them to surface when ready. And the girl watched the men move about the room as if measuring whether stillness could be trusted. The rancher split kindling near the stove, movement steady and unhurried, while the cowboy rinsed the cup and set it back without comment. both of them careful not to crowd her with attention that might feel like inspection. When the girl shifted her weight and winced, the rancher noticed and adjusted the chair closer to the fire, explaining simply that warmth returned unevenly, that aches were part of the body remembering itself. And the explanation mattered because it treated pain as expected rather than alarming. She nodded, absorbing the words as much as the heat, and pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, the smell of smoke clinging to it like proof that the night had passed. Outside, a bird tested the silence with a brief call, and the sound drew her gaze to the window, where the snow lay quieter now, less threatening in daylight, and she asked whether it would start again. The cowboy answered honestly that winter always came back, but that it never owned a place outright. And the truth of it steadied her more than reassurance would have. The ranchers said they would not ask her where she came from until she chose to tell them, because questions asked too early often turned into burdens, and the decision landed gently, giving her something she had not been offered in a long time: control over her own story. She tested that control by asking a question of her own, wanting to know why they had helped her when others might not have. And the rancher replied that help was easier when it arrived, before excuses did. The cowboy added that he had seen what snow did when people hesitated, and he did not intend to watch it happen again. And the simplicity of the answer allowed it to stand without explanation. The girl considered them both, eyes moving between faces that held no urgency to claim her or define her. And the absence of pressure made room for trust to form slowly rather than all at once. When she leaned back and closed her eyes briefly, it was not to escape but to rest, and the men let the moment pass without comment, understanding that recovery was not a straight line. The fire held steady, the room warmed by degrees, and the questions that lingered stayed where they belonged for now, waiting their turn, because some answers survived only when patience made space for them to arrive. By midday, the warmth had settled deeper, no longer clinging only to skin, but reaching the places that made movement possible. And the girl stood for the first time without swaying, feet planted on the wooden floor as if testing whether the ground would hold her. The cowboy stayed close without hovering, pretending to busy himself with a saddle strap while watching her from the corner of his eye. And the rancher observed more openly, gauging color in her face, steadiness in her hands. The small signs that told him danger had loosened its grip. She took a careful step, then another, surprise flickering across her face at the strength that had returned in pieces rather than all at once. And the discovery carried a quiet pride she did not try to hide. The rancher said they would keep her inside for the rest of the day, that cold liked to come back when it thought it had been forgotten, and she accepted the rule without protest, understanding that protection was not punishment when it was explained. Outside, the snow thinned further, sunlight breaking through clouds just enough to remind the land it still existed beneath the white. And the sight stirred something restless in her, a habit of watching for the moment she might need to run again. The cowboy noticed and asked whether she had somewhere she meant to go, not pressing, only opening a door she could choose to step through or not. She shook her head slowly, then hesitated, and said there had been a place once, but it was gone now. The words flat with familiarity rather than grief. The rancher nodded, not asking what had taken it, because loss spoke clearly enough on its own. And he said there were places that could be built again, sometimes differently, sometimes better, if people were willing to stay. The girl listened, fingers worrying the edge of the blanket, weighing the idea as if it were heavier than it sounded, and asked what staying would mean. The rancher answered that it meant work when she was able, rest when she was not, and honesty in both directions, nothing promised beyond that. And the cowboy added that staying did not mean never leaving, only leaving with somewhere to return to. The words settled between them, unforced, and the girl felt something unfamiliar take root. Not certainty, but possibility, the kind that frightened and steadied her at the same time. She looked toward the window again, then back at the fire, and finally at the two men who had not hurried her story or claimed her gratitude. And she said she would stay until the snow was gone. The rancher accepted the answer as it was, not more and not less. And the cowboy smiled once, brief and unremarkable, because choices that mattered rarely announced themselves loudly. As the afternoon wore on, the ranch resumed its quiet rhythm around them, and the girl moved within it carefully, aware that something had begun without ceremony. A choice taking shape, not declared, but warming slowly, like the fire they had built. Together and refused to let die, the afternoon settled into its own pace, and with it came the quieter labor that followed rescue, the kind that asked for steadiness rather than speed. And the girl watched as the rancher laid out simple tasks without turning them into tests. He showed her where clean water was kept, how to sit close enough to the stove to feel its heat without courting burns, and when to rest without apology, explaining that staying alive in winter was as much about knowing when not to move as it was about knowing when to act. The cowboy went back to his gear, mending a strap and knocking snow from his boots. Yet he checked on her often enough that she noticed the pattern, not as supervision, but as habit, and the consistency began to matter. When she offered to help, the rancher handed her a small bundle of kindling to stack near the hearth, work light enough to respect what her body had endured. And she did it carefully, pleased by the normalcy of being useful. Outside, the snow thinned to a fine drift, the world reappearing in pieces, and the sight stirred an old tension in her shoulders that eased only when the door stayed shut against the cold. The rancher spoke then about winter routines, about how storms passed if met with preparation rather than panic. And the lesson felt larger than weather, landing in the space she had been forced to navigate alone for too long. She asked what would happen when the snow finally cleared, whether she would be expected to move on. And the rancher answered that expectation was a conversation, not an order, and that staying meant choosing again each day, not being claimed once. The cowboy added that leaving did not erase what had been built, and that returning was always harder than running, and the honesty of it steadied her more than promises ever could. As dusk approached, the rancher checked the fire and said they would eat together, a statement that carried weight without ceremony, and the girl felt the word together settle into her in a way that surprised her. When they sat at the table, the meal simple and warm. Conversation moved easily around weather and work, leaving space where questions might later fit. And she realized that the work of staying was not dramatic, not loud, but built from ordinary moments repeated until trust had time to take hold. The fire burned low and steady, the ranch holding its ground against the cold, and the girl understood that being raised together would not arrive in a single declaration, but in days like this one, where safety was proven by patience and the choice to remain was renewed without being demanded. When night returned, it did so without threat, settling over the ranch in a quiet that felt earned rather than imposed. And the girl noticed the difference immediately, because fear sounded different when it arrived uninvited. The wind brushed the walls instead of striking them, and the fire answered with a steady glow that held its shape, refusing to flare or fade. And the rancher said nothing as he checked the latch and banked the coals, trusting routine to do its work. The cowboy took the chair near the door again, not as a guard, but as a habit formed in weather and kept through choice. And the girl watched him for a moment before turning back to the hearth, comforted by the predictability of his presence. When she lay down on the pallet they had set near the fire, She hesitated only once, a pause that carried the memory of nights spent listening for danger, and the rancher noticed and set a lantern low enough to leave the room lit, saying simply that darkness did not need to prove anything tonight. The girl's breathing slowed, then steadied, and sleep arrived in pieces rather than all at once. Careful and shallow at first, then deeper as the fire crackled softly. Outside, the snow shifted and settled, but it did not press itself against the walls, and the quiet held. The cowboy rose once to add a log, careful not to wake her, and the movement felt deliberate rather than urgent, a choice rather than a reaction. The rancher listened to the rhythm of the room and thought about morning tasks, about the long work ahead that would not announce itself with drama. And the thought did not weigh on him as it might have before, because responsibility, once shared, felt lighter. The girl dreamed without panic, images unformed and gentle, and when she stirred it was only to pull the blanket closer, a small motion that spoke of trust arriving before language could name it. By the time dawn hinted at the edges of the window, it was clear that night had not taken her back, that the cold had lost its hold not through force, but through care repeated without interruption. The fire burned down to embers, still warm, still present, and the ranch held its ground, because some rescues were not measured by the moment they began, but by the nights that passed afterward without demanding proof. Morning arrived clear and quiet, sunlight stretching across the floorboards in a way that felt deliberate, and the girl woke without the sharp start she had grown used to, eyes opening slowly as if her body trusted the day enough to meet it halfway. The fire had been stirred back to life, its warmth steady, and the smell of coffee and bread reached her before voices did, grounding her in the ordinary. The rancher moved about the room with practiced ease, setting food out without ceremony, while the cowboy stepped outside to check the stock, his boots crunching lightly on snow that had begun to harden instead of deepen. The girl sat up and realized she was not afraid to move, that the room no longer felt like a place she might be asked to leave without warning. And the realization settled into her with a quiet certainty. When she joined them at the table, the rancher nodded once, acknowledging her presence the way one acknowledged anyone who belonged to the morning routine. And the normalcy of it mattered more than kindness. She ate slowly, tasting warmth rather than hunger, and listened as the men spoke about fences needing repair and weather holding for at least another day. Conversations that did not revolve around her, yet made space for her to exist within them. After the meal, the ranchers said they would speak plainly now that she was stronger, not pressing but offering honesty in return for it. And she agreed, understanding that staying meant being seen. She told them what little she could, of losing her parents, of moving from place to place until there had been nowhere left to go, and of the night the snow came down harder than she expected, erasing the road she thought she knew. The cowboy listened without interruption, jaw set not in anger but in resolve, and the rancher asked only what was necessary, keeping the rest for later when words might come easier. When she finished, the room did not rush to fill the silence, and the pause felt respectful rather than empty. The rancher said they would make arrangements, not adoption spoken loudly, but care made practical. School when weather allowed, work suited to her strength, a place at the table that did not depend on gratitude. The cowboy returned then, brushing snow from his coat, and added that raising someone together meant patience as much as protection, and he was prepared for both. The girl felt the weight of the statement, not as a promise made lightly, but as a decision already in motion, and she nodded, accepting the morning as it was. Outside, the snow began to melt in thin lines. water finding its way back to the earth. And inside the ranch, something settled just as quietly, because morning had done what night could not. It had made the choice official without needing to say it out loud. The days that followed did not announce themselves as a turning point, and that was how the girl knew something real was happening. Because change that lasted rarely arrived with ceremony. Snow melted in uneven patches around the ranch, revealing earth that had waited patiently beneath it. And the girl moved through the mornings with growing confidence, learning the rhythm of small tasks that asked for attention rather than strength. The ranchers showed her how to gather eggs without startling the hens, explaining that calm hands kept everyone safer. And she listened closely, pleased by work that trusted her instead of testing her. The cowboy repaired fences and let her watch from a distance at first, then closer, answering questions when she asked and letting silence do the rest. And the balance taught her that together did not mean constant closeness, only reliability. At meals, conversation widened naturally, touching on weather, livestock, and plans that reached just far enough ahead to feel stable without becoming overwhelming. And she learned when to speak and when to listen, sensing that both had value here. At night, the fire remained steady, and the lantern stayed lit without explanation, a habit that had become part of the house rather than an accommodation. And she slept through the dark without waking to check the door. When worry surfaced, as it still did, it passed more quickly, replaced by routine that anchored her to the present instead of pulling her back into what had been lost. The rancher spoke once about the future, not framing it as destiny, but as work shared over time. And the cowboy added that raising someone together meant arguing quietly when needed and agreeing loudly when it mattered. A truth she stored away without fully understanding yet. One afternoon, she laughed at something small and ordinary, the sound surprising all of them. And the rancher smiled without comment, because the moment did not need explanation to be important. The snow retreated further each day, the land reappearing piece by piece, and the girl realized that together meant showing up even when nothing dramatic was happening, even when the day asked only for patience and care. By the time the road became visible again, no longer erased by white, she understood that being raised together was not about rescue remembered, but about days repeated, where safety was proven quietly and belonging grew without needing to be named. Spring did not arrive all at once, but the cold loosened its grip enough for the land to breathe again. And the girl noticed how the ranch changed with it, fences standing clearer against earth that had been hidden too long. She moved through the days without asking where she belonged, because the answer no longer needed to be spoken, woven instead into ordinary routines that held without effort. The rancher treated her presence as settled fact, assigning work suited to her strength and listening when she spoke, correcting gently when needed and never reminding her why she was there, because beginnings mattered less than continuance. The cowboy remained a constant, leaving early and returning late, always checking the fire before night fell. Not out of fear anymore, but habit turned promise. And the steadiness of it anchored her more than words ever could. When neighbors finally rode up, drawn by weather and curiosity, the girl stood beside the rancher without hesitation, introduced not as a rescue or a burden, but as someone who lived there now, and the simplicity of it closed a door she had never known how to shut. Questions came, polite and cautious, but none were allowed to pry, and the boundaries held because they had been practiced long enough to feel natural. One evening, as dusk settled soft and gold instead of sharp and white, the girl added a log to the fire on her own, the movement unremarkable and complete. And both men noticed without comment, understanding what it meant. She no longer watched the flames to measure survival, only warmth, and the shift felt quiet but permanent. When she spoke about the future, it was not framed by escape or fear, but by work she wanted to learn and places she might see, all rooted in the certainty that there was somewhere to return. The rancher listened and nodded. The cowboy smiled once, and neither corrected her language when she said, "Home," because correction would have broken something carefully built. Outside, the last of the snow vanished into earth that accepted it without protest. And inside, the fire burned as it always had, steady and unremarkable. No longer a question to be answered, but a fact to be maintained. The girl understood then that being raised together was not a moment declared in crisis, but a life chosen afterward, one day at a time, and the knowledge settled into her with the calm certainty of warmth that had finally learned it would not be taken away. If this story warmed your heart, like the video, share it with someone who believes family is chosen, and subscribe for more Western American tales.